Leona had always known her place in the empire. She was a maid, an invisible shadow flitting through the grand halls of nobility, bowing her head, speaking only when spoken to. But behind her quiet demeanor lay something far more dangerous than a noble's title or an emperor's decree. Leona had a mind sharper than any blade. Born as the illegitimate daughter of a disgraced noble, she had no claim to power, no inheritance, and no future. The best she could hope for was to survive. But Leona never believed in merely surviving. She listened when others ignored her. She observed when others boasted. She learned the secrets of the powerful, studied their weaknesses, and in time, she realized a simple truth. Power did not belong to the strongest or the wealthiest. It belonged to the ones who knew how to pull the strings from the shadows. And so, Leona became the empire's most brilliant strategist while wearing a servant's uniform. When ministers clashed over political disputes, it was her carefully placed words that turned the tide. When nobles schemed against one another, it was her unseen hand that guided their destruction. With nothing but intelligence and manipulation, Leona carved her influence into the foundation of the empire, shaping its future from behind velvet curtains. But power, no matter how subtle, never goes unnoticed forever. One evening, as she stood by the towering windows of the palace, overlooking the city below, a strange feeling settled in her chest. A premonition. She had spent years perfecting her game, but something was different this time. The air was heavier, the whispers colder. She had always been careful, but had she been careful enough? She turned back to the ballroom, where nobles laughed and drank, unaware of the storm that loomed just beyond the empire's walls. The rebellion had begun. She had orchestrated it, controlled its movements, ensured that it would serve her ends. But rebellions, like fire, were unpredictable. And tonight, she would learn that even the cleverest minds could miscalculate. Before the night ended, her influence would shatter. Those who once whispered in secret would turn against her. And when the empire crumbled, Leona, the brilliant, cunning maid, would fall with it. And yet, that was not the end of her story. Because when the final moment came, when betrayal struck deep and the world turned to black, Leona opened her eyes. Her breath caught. The scent of dust and old linens filled her lungs. She was no longer in the palace, no longer running for her life, no longer moments from death. She was in a tiny servant's room, a place she hadn't seen in years. Her hands trembled as she reached up to touch her face. Smooth, untouched. No scars, no wounds. She stumbled out of bed, catching her reflection in the small mirror hanging by the door. The same wide eyes, the same youthful face, the same trembling lips. The truth hit her all at once. She was back. Years before her downfall, years before the rebellion, years before her greatest mistake. This was her second chance. And this time, she would not be a mere shadow in the palace. This time, she would not manipulate from behind the curtains. This time, she would rule. Leona had been betrayed before. She had been stabbed in the back, figuratively and literally, by those she had once trusted, by those who had whispered their secrets into her ear as if she were nothing more than a tool for their ambitions. She had always believed she could outmaneuver them all, that her intellect would shield her from the cruelty of fate. She had been wrong. The empire had crumbled before her eyes. The rebellion she had unknowingly nurtured in the shadows had spiraled beyond her control, consuming the nobility in a firestorm of blood and vengeance. And in the end, her enemies had come for her. She remembered the cold stone beneath her knees as she was dragged before the high court, the mockery of a trial where her crimes were read aloud. Not crimes of bloodshed or treason, but crimes of knowledge, of knowing too much. She had played the game too well, and for that they had sentenced her to die. She had felt the blade at her throat. She had felt the world fade into darkness. And then she awoke, not in a dungeon, not in the void of death, but in her old servant's quarters. 5 years before her execution, Leona sat motionless on the edge of her bed, her fingers trembling as she clutched the thin, familiar bedsheets. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and for the first time in years, perhaps for the first time in her life, fear gripped her. This was not a dream. The scent of aged wood, the faint chatter of servants preparing for the day, The warmth of sunlight filtering through the dust-covered window. It was all real. She stumbled out of bed, rushing to the small mirror that hung on the wall. A face stared back at her. A face untouched by time, free of the exhaustion and scars she had carried at the end of her life. Her skin was smooth, her eyes sharp with youth, her dark hair spilling over her shoulders in a loose, unkempt braid. Her hands flew to her neck. No scars, no marks from the blade that had ended her life. She had returned. Leona staggered back, gripping the wooden table for support as the weight of realization crashed down on her. The Empire had not yet fallen. The rebellion had not yet begun. The war, the betrayals, the destruction, they had not yet happened. She had 5 years. 5 years before the world collapsed. 5 years before she was executed. A sharp breath left her lips as panic clawed at her throat. But panic was a weakness she could not afford. If she had been granted this second chance, if fate, or some cruel unknown force, had sent her back, then she would not waste it. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to think. Her greatest mistake in her past life had been underestimating the Empire's rot. She had believed that by controlling the right people, she could hold everything together, manipulate events to suit her survival. But she had been wrong, because in the end, the Empire had not collapsed because of any single individual. It had collapsed because its foundation had been crumbling from within long before she ever played her first move. Her old methods would not work. This time, she could not simply manipulate the Empire from the shadows. This time, she had to strengthen it. Her fingers tightened into fists. If she was to survive, she needed power. Not just hidden influence, but real, undeniable power. And there was only one person in the Empire who could give it to her. The Crown Prince! Leona let out a slow breath, steadying herself. In her past life, she had despised the Crown Prince. Not because he was cruel or foolish. On the contrary, he had been one of the few nobles who had genuinely cared for his empire. But that was precisely why he had been dangerous. She had orchestrated his downfall before, played a careful game that ensured he would never become emperor. Now, she would do the opposite. Now, she would make him king. A sharp knock on her door snapped her out of her thoughts. "Leona!" a voice called impatiently. "Are you still asleep? The headmaid is already in a foul mood. If you don't hurry, you'll—" The door swung open, and a girl with wide, startled eyes stepped in. It took Leona a moment to recognize her. Adele, a fellow servant, one of the few who had treated her with kindness in her past life. "You look pale," Adele said, her brows knitting together in concern. "Are you feeling well?" Leona's lips parted, but no words came out. She had been given a second chance, but everything around her was unchanged. Adele was still here, still alive, still blissfully unaware of the storm that was coming. Leona had to act. No. She had to move faster than before. Adele was still waiting for an answer. Leona straightened her back, forcing a small, reassuring smile. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady. "I just had a strange dream." Adele huffed, rolling her eyes. "If you have time for dreams, you have time to work. Come on, we have to hurry before the headmaid loses her patience again." Leona nodded and followed, but her mind was elsewhere. Her path had changed. In her past life, she had walked into her downfall, step by step, believing she was the master of the game. This time, she would rewrite fate itself. This time, she would not fall. This time, she would win. Leona moved through the palace with a newfound awareness. Everything was the same as before. The same corridors, the same whispered gossip among the nobles, the same air of deception that had always lingered beneath the Empire's grandeur. But this time, she was different. She was no longer the foolish girl who believed she could control fate with clever schemes and well-placed secrets. That path had led to her downfall. If she wanted to survive, if she wanted to win, she needed a new strategy. The rebellion would come. The Empire would fall. The Crown Prince would die. Unless she stopped it. The problem was, how? She had no wealth, no noble title, no army to command. She was nothing more than a maid, the most powerless piece on the board. And yet, hadn't she proven before that power was not just about birthright? The palace was full of men who held titles but lacked intelligence, generals who had never fought a real battle, nobles who traded influence like it was a game. The emperor himself, paranoid and indecisive, swayed by whichever voice whispered into his ear the loudest. Leona had spent years learning their weaknesses, and this time, she would use that knowledge differently. If she wanted power, she didn't need to own it. She just needed to be the one who directed it. And that meant finding the right person to influence. It meant getting close to the crown prince. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Leona! Adele grabbed her arm as they scrubbed the marble floors of the eastern corridor. The head maid wants you to help deliver wine to the royal council today. Leona's fingers froze against the soapy rag. The royal council. That was where the empire's true decisions were made. Where the emperor's most trusted men gathered to discuss war, politics, and power. She had never been inside before. Servants only entered when necessary, and even then, they were nothing more than invisible hands pouring drinks. But for her, this was more than just a task. It was an opportunity. She turned to Adele, schooling her expression into something neutral. "I see," she said smoothly. "I'll go right away." Inside, her heart was racing. She wasn't ready. She didn't have a plan. But if life had taught her anything, it was that hesitation was a luxury only fools could afford. And she would not be a fool again. The air inside the royal council chamber was heavy with tension. Leona moved with silent precision, balancing a tray of silver goblets filled with wine. She kept her head bowed, her steps slow and deliberate, blending into the background like a shadow. And yet her ears were sharp. "The southern provinces are restless," one noble was saying. "The grain supply is dwindling, and the local lords are growing desperate. The military is already stretched thin," another grumbled. "We can't afford another rebellion." "We wouldn't need to afford one if the crown prince took this matter seriously." Leona's gaze flickered toward the man they were talking about. The crown prince sat at the head of the table, his hands folded, his expression unreadable. Leona had watched him from a distance in her past life. She had heard the rumors, how he was different from the rest of the nobility, how he sought to fix the empire's flaws rather than exploit them. But by the time she had realized his true worth, it had been too late. This time, she had 5 years before his downfall. This time, she would not let him die. And that meant she needed to speak to him. The thought sent a cold shiver through her. A mere maid approaching the crown prince? It was insanity. If she said the wrong thing, she would be executed on the spot. But if she stayed silent, if she did nothing, history would repeat itself. Leona placed the last goblet of wine before the prince, her pulse hammering against her ribs. And then, in the quietest whisper, she said, "The empire is weaker than you think, your highness." A slow, measured breath left the crown prince's lips. For the first time, he looked at her, not through her, as nobles often did with servants, but at her. And in that moment, Leona knew. She had his attention. The moment lasted no more than a second, a heartbeat. Then, the prince's gaze flickered away, and the conversation around the table continued as if nothing had happened. But Leona knew better. She could feel it, the shift, the question hanging in the air. Had he heard her? Would he dismiss it as nothing more than a servant's foolishness? Or had she just altered the course of fate itself? Leona withdrew quickly, her hands steady despite the wild beating of her heart. She couldn't risk drawing more attention to herself. Not yet. She left the chamber with the other servants, her mind already racing. This was just the beginning. If she had planted even the smallest seed of doubt in the prince's mind, then it was enough, because she knew something the rest of the royal council did not. The empire's collapse was not a possibility. It was a certainty, and she was the only one who could stop it. She had just taken her first step toward an alliance with the very man she had once destroyed. And this time, she would not fail. Leona knew she had crossed a line. A mere maid had spoken in the presence of the royal council. That was enough to warrant punishment. But instead of fear, a thrill ran through her. The crown prince had noticed her. Even if it was only a moment, even if he thought nothing of it now, she had planted a thought in his mind. A small whisper of doubt about the empire's stability. And doubt was the most powerful weapon of all. But her actions would not go unnoticed. 2 days later, she felt the shift. The glances from other servants. The sudden, watchful eyes of the head maid. Even the nobles seemed to linger when she passed, as if sensing something was different about her. It was dangerous. But Leona had spent a lifetime surviving in the shadows of the palace. She knew how to hide. For now, she needed to wait. Observe. play the part of the obedient maid while the nobility whispered and schemed. And most importantly, she needed to know if the crown prince remembered her words. She got her answer faster than expected. That night, as she was finishing her duties in the empty hallways of the eastern wing, a voice stopped her cold. "You are a bold one." She turned sharply, her heart skipping a beat. The crown prince stood before her, his sharp eyes studying her with quiet calculation. Leona immediately lowered her gaze, forcing herself into the familiar posture of submission. "Your Highness," she murmured, feigning meekness. "Look at me." Her breath caught. A direct command. Slowly, she lifted her chin, meeting his gaze. His expression was unreadable, but Leona had spent years learning to decipher noble masks. He was testing her. "You spoke during the royal council," he said, tilting his head slightly. That was either an act of recklessness or audacity. Leona forced her voice to remain steady. "It was neither, Your Highness." "Then what was it?" She hesitated. This was a dangerous moment. One wrong word, and she would be removed from the palace before she could make another move. But one right word. "Ew, it was a warning," she finally said, voice barely above a whisper. The crown prince's lips pressed into a thin line. His fingers drummed lightly against the hilt of his sword. Then, unexpectedly, a small smirk touched his lips. "Interesting." Leona felt her pulse quicken. He was intrigued. Not convinced, not yet, but intrigued. And that was enough. For now. The next few weeks passed in careful silence. Leona returned to her duties as though nothing had changed. But beneath the surface, everything had. The prince was watching her. She felt it whenever she entered a room. A passing glance, a lingering gaze. He was measuring her, trying to understand her. It was dangerous, but necessary. And then, just when she thought she had secured a foothold, everything collapsed. One evening, she was pulled into the headmaid's chambers without warning. She immediately knew something was wrong. The headmaid's usual cold indifference had been replaced with something far worse. Suspicion. "You've been called to the high steward's office," the woman said, her voice clipped. Leona's fingers tightened around the hem of her apron. The high steward, a man who answered only to the emperor himself, a man who had ordered her execution in her past life. And now, he wanted to see her. The high steward's chambers were suffocating. Leona stood perfectly still, keeping her expression blank as the man stared her down. "You are a clever girl," he finally said, his voice smooth and calculated. "Too clever for a maid." Leona lowered her eyes. "I do not understand, my lord." "Oh, I think you do." The weight of his gaze was suffocating. "I know you're kind," he continued, leaning back in his chair. "You think because you can listen, because you can observe, that you are above your station." Leona remained silent. "You spoke in the royal council," he continued. "The crown prince did not punish you. That is interesting." Leona's blood ran cold. This was a trap. The high steward was a master of manipulation. He had orchestrated countless political deaths in her past life. If he saw her as a threat, he would eliminate her. And yet, he had not reported her yet, which meant he was testing her. Leona swallowed, carefully choosing her words. "It was a mistake, my lord. I spoke without thinking." The high steward studied her, his gaze sharp and unforgiving. Then he smiled. "A mistake," he repeated. "See that you do not make another." Leona bowed, her heart pounding. She had survived. For now. But one thing was clear. Someone had betrayed her. Someone had told the high steward about her words. And if she didn't find out who, she would not survive for long. The air inside the palace was growing heavier, thick with tension that had not yet erupted into chaos, but soon would. Leona could feel the shift. The rebellion she had once ignored in her past life was beginning to stir again. But unlike before, when she had remained in the shadows, she was watching it unfold with terrifying clarity. And this time, she was not powerless. She had placed herself in the crown prince's line of sight. She had drawn the attention of the high steward. She had already changed fate, but how much? Was it enough to stop what was coming? Or was she still doomed? The next few weeks passed like a game of chess. The crown prince continued to observe her, though he never spoke to her directly. The high steward, despite his warnings, had not moved against her. And yet, Leona knew she was being watched. Every step, every glance, every breath felt scrutinized. She needed to act. She needed to force the crown prince's hand. One evening, as she was walking through the palace gardens, she stopped near the eastern pavilion, a place where nobles rarely gathered at this hour, a place where she knew the crown prince often stood alone, and as if fate had aligned with her, there he was. He stood near the stone railing, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Leona took a breath and stepped forward. "You already knew, didn't you?" she said softly. The crown prince did not turn, but she knew he had heard her. "Knew what?" he asked after a long silence. Leona exhaled. "That the empire is breaking, that the rebellion is already beginning to form, that the noble families are preparing to betray you." Finally, he turned. His sharp golden eyes locked onto hers. "And how," he said slowly, "does a maid know such things?" Leona's heart pounded. This was it. This was the moment that would decide whether she survived or perished. She had to make him believe her. So, she lifted her chin and said the most dangerous words of her life. "Because I have seen it happen before." Silence. The crown prince did not move, did not blink, but Leona could feel the shift in the air between them, a tension that coiled like a predator waiting to strike. "You have seen it happen before?" he repeated, voice eerily calm. Leona could not tell him the truth. She could not tell him that she had lived through the empire's fall, that she had died because of it, and that she had been given a second chance. He would never believe her, so she chose a half-truth instead. I have spent my life watching," she said, "listening to whispers no one else hears. I know the patterns. I know how power shifts before it crumbles. And right now, Your Highness, the empire is on the edge of collapse." She saw the flicker of doubt in his gaze. She needed to push further. "If you do nothing," she continued, voice unwavering, "the rebellion will rise. The nobles will betray you, and everything you have fought for will burn." A long, dangerous silence stretched between them. Then, finally, "You speak as if you know these things," the crown prince murmured. Leona swallowed. "I do." A slow smirk touched his lips. "Then prove it." The crown prince did not dismiss her, nor did he have her executed. Instead, he gave her a test. "Tell me," he said, leaning against the railing. "Who will betray me first?" Leona's breath hitched. This was a trap, a way to see if she was truly as clever as she claimed, or just another fool with empty words. But Leona was not a fool. She had lived this life once before. She already knew who the first traitor would be. She met his gaze without hesitation. "The Duke of Ren," she said. The crown prince's expression did not change, but she could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes. "You speak with certainty." "I am certain," she replied. The Duke of Ren had been one of the first nobles to switch sides in her past life. He had smiled at the crown prince while secretly feeding intelligence to the rebellion, and when the empire began to fall, he had been the one to deliver the final blow. If the crown prince still doubted her, he did not show it. Instead, he simply said, "We shall see if your prediction is correct." Leona clenched her fists. This was her chance. If she was right, if she could prove herself, then she would secure her place at the prince's side. And if she was wrong, she would die. Again. But this time she would not fail. This time she would win. And as she walked away from the garden that night, she knew the game had truly begun.